Favoritism means showing partiality, bias, or prejudice. It is literally playing favorites. In his letter to new Christians, James wrote about this behavior. Let's read James 2, verses 1 through 4. My brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus, must not show favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring in fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, "Here's a good seat for you," but say to the poor man, "You stand there, or sit on the floor by my feet," have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? It is a natural response for humans to favor some people over others. We often favor our family over strangers or friends over teachers. Here, James was specifically calling out Christians for showing more respect for and interest in wealthy people and ignoring the poor. There's no place for this kind of discrimination among Christians. We are called to love others as Christ loves each of us without bias, prejudice, partiality, or playing favorites. When we show favoritism, we aren't seeing people the way God sees them. If we show favoritism, we are sinning. Favoritism is discrimination, and discrimination separates and isolates. The Salvation Army played an important role among the so-called criminal tribes of India. The story of the criminal tribes is a story of separation and isolation, of labels that exclude, of discrimination. It's a sad story. But it's in these dark places that the Salvation Army is called to shine God's light. The story of the criminal tribe started with members of a cult devoted to the Hindu goddess Kali, which means she who is death. The cult members were literally called the thugs, which is where we get the term we use today. They were murderers and thieves. Between 1740 and 1840, they murdered 1 million people. Then 3,000 thugs were captured and imprisoned or executed. Some tribes, mostly from the lower poorer caste, modeled the thugs' behavior and lived by crime, making sections of India really dangerous. They were known as criminal tribes. The government in India claimed the right to arrest and relocate people who were identified as part of a criminal tribe. The government relocated them to settlements, similar to Native American reservations in the United States. The government believed that you didn't become a criminal because of toxic influences. They believed you were born a criminal if you were born into a criminal tribe. Criminal tribes were isolated, locked up at night in modified prisons. They worked as city scavengers during the day because they were around criminals, being isolated with and influenced by them all the time. Those who weren't criminals pretty much were guaranteed to become criminals eventually, setting up a vicious cycle in these tribes. The government couldn't reform them. They asked the Salvation Army to help. Frederick Booth Tucker believed that the first step towards change was to expose people to better influences and show them kindness. The Salvation Army housed and fed the people, teaching them how to keep themselves clean and healthy. They were put to work in weaving, farming, and forestry. Then the Salvation Army found places for them to sell what they grew and made. Each evening, the Salvation Army held a meeting with music. They also gave the children an education. Change is rarely immediate. The Salvation Army saw slow and steady change among the criminal tribe they were working with. Because of the change in this one settlement, the government asked the Salvation Army to work with other criminal tribes. They eventually helped in 28 settlements, serving over 6,000 individuals. The success with the criminal tribes led the government to have the Salvation Army work with a prison of about 1,000 young men, helping them upon their release. Frederick Booth Tucker made a different suggestion. Release the men from 6 months to a couple years before the end of their sentence. The condition was they went to the Salvation Army for the remainder of their sentence. The government agreed. The young men were suspicious at first, but the experiment eventually proved to be a great success. When it was time for their release, they went home having earned money while working under the Salvation Army's oversight. They didn't have the usual stigma of prisoners who had nothing when their sentence was up. Eventually, government leadership changed and decided that the Salvation Army wasn't needed. They would handle the prisoners on their own. A few months later, Frederick Booth Tucker visited to see how it was going. He was surprised to find the young men chained together with a guard of nearly 100 police. What was the difference? The jail staff wanted to contain and restrict them. The Salvation Army wanted to build relationships with them and help them to know Jesus. The government's goal was to deal with punishment and consequences for the crime. The Salvation Army's goal was to love people and help them be integrated back into society. Salvationists knew that these young men weren't just criminals with nothing to offer. They were valuable contributors to society made in the image of God. The main way to integrate them back into their community successfully was by changing the influences. The Salvation Army worked to get them away from those who dragged them down and put them into situations that encouraged them to be good, to be who God created them to be.